As mentioned, my name is Candice Lanius, and I'm a PhD candidate currently at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Communication and Media. And today I'm here to talk to you guys about potentially implementing self-tracking or quantified self-technologies as part of your own therapeutic practices. As a little bit of background then, what is quantified self and self-tracking? Quantified self and self-tracking is the use of modern information communication technologies such as your smartphone, your tablet, your computer, and more modern sensor technologies such as GPS, heart rate monitors, and gyroscopes, and inputting all of that data in order to track the social, biological, and psychological inputs from an individual in order to analyze it and optimize it for something. Whether that target is to try to treat anxiety, perform better as an athlete, all of these things are possible outputs that you would target with this sort of self-tracking strategy. With sensor growths in smartphones, there's only more opportunities in the near future for this sort of science and this sort of research to occur. Even in the last 5 years, there's been a massive increase in these that just come standard as part of our smartphones. So things such as proximity sensors, the accelerometer came before, but now we have the heart rate and fingerprint metrics, which can all be used as part of this data collection and processing and analysis to try to find these insights from data. Several examples are, of course, the heart rate monitor, as mentioned earlier. That's something that I frequently use in order to track my heart rate to run more efficiently and to reach target zones to optimize my own performance. Other things, such as this example with the Apple Watch, where you receive push notifications for your mood input, and then you can say how you're feeling. It records your location. You can put something in about where you are, and then you can determine trends over time to see what might be triggering different mood states. And all of this is done with that goal in mind to sort of improve mood or to improve performance. A more scientific research example, recently from Wang et al., 2014, created an application where they were tracking Dartmouth students, 48 in all, over 10 weeks, to find correlations between these automatic inputs of digital data in addition to some added subjective data that the students provided on their own using surveys and textual inputs directly into their devices. And they created these metrics that they then used to sort of understand if there's any relationship between this self-tracking and then the eventual student performance. What they found is that there are significant correlations between things like eating and sleeping, sort of duh, but they can actually track how much of an effect those things have on student outcomes and student socialization. So these are all good things moving forward into the future for why quantified self and self-tracking might be a useful tool for these sorts of studies. For the origin of this talk, in May 5th of 2015, I actually was very slow on the curve to get my own smartphone. I had been using a dumb phone as a PhD in communication and media for a while, and the irony got to me. So I actually got my first smartphone and went way overboard. What I ended up doing was downloading a ton of apps and started recording everything from nutrition to sleeping to my mood, work intervals. You know, if it could be tracked, I was tracking it. And I found that by doing so much of this all at once, there were a couple of observations that I realized through self-reflection. One of that is that when I would input this data into the technology, I had expectations about what it would tell me, about how to optimize my own performance. But what happened was there's this black box part of it where the software and the hardware is processing the data and then giving me insights that I didn't agree with. And there was no way to argue with the machine. The machine said, do this, and that was it. So that was a tension and conflict that emerged through my own personal experience with this. Little did I realize after I published this article that other people had also been experiencing some of these tensions between what the technology says you should do and what your own personal sense of self is. So that led to a radio interview with Nora Young from Spark, where she brought on several other experts, and they were talking about this issue of tracking and control and what happens if the personal sense of self comes in conflict with what the technology is advising for you to do. So looking through this, we start to look at how, I'm using the word anxiety here in a non-technical sense, of course, in front of this audience, where it causes some sort of a feeling of not rightness with what is being given to you as an output or objective insight. And so there's something that we're going to be looking at today when we look at implementing these technologies in the therapeutic relationship. So the overview for the talk today is I'm hoping to provide you with all of the information, the pros and the cons, the possible consequences, the possible benefits, so that all of you can evaluate whether this is something that you would be interested in doing in your own work. As an overview for this talk, we're answering that question, to self-track or not to self-track. That is the question. I will begin by discussing my approach, which is coming from user experience and digital rhetoric. I will then look at don't self-track, which is an overview of the current non-technologically mediated relationship and a couple of things that are problematic with it currently and arguments for why you would then want to use self-tracking. Looking at self-tracking with existing commercial applications, which have a lot of potential pitfalls that we would like to avoid. And then self-tracking with customized applications that are being built by NIH-funded research or being built by nonprofit organizations who are invested in this sort of self-tracking for the greater good. And then we'll conclude with several conclusions. So the first thing then, my approach, we start with user experience. User experience design, it looks at minimizing the barriers for an individual to complete an interaction successfully. It is useful for understanding a problem or situation fully before you actually design a solution. So it's also part of conceptual design, looking at the full ecosystem of a situation prior to just throwing a technology in. In this instance, we're sort of scratching the user and we're looking at patients, which are a very particular type of user. They have known special needs or requirements that must be addressed when you're looking at designing applications that fulfill their needs and remove the barriers for them to have a successful interaction. One way to do this is looking at the patient experience as a chart. Chronologically, with the sort of pain points when they enter into an interaction, and who they're interacting with, whether it be the sort of front end, which would be the practitioners who are interacting with them on the day-to-day, versus the back end of the interaction. So what is necessary as an institutional organization to support the overarching end-user experience. As an example of this, I've provided a patient experience map. The important aspects of this are on the left side. So as I just mentioned, there are the stages. There's the pre-diagnosis, the diagnosis stage, and then the treatment and maintenance. On the upper left, you'll see their sentiment. So users could describe how they felt at each aspect of this journey through receiving treatment. And so you can start to see where it might be advantageous to use some sort of self-tracking technology to address high anxiety or some weakness that exists in the system. There's also pain points, of course, where individuals felt like they couldn't continue with the interaction, they didn't have enough information, or they didn't know the right person to contact to continue. And then individual thoughts and actions that they took then to overcome those issues. So by mapping this sort of patient experience, we can start to see those moments where self-tracking would complicate the current existing practices. And those, adapting from Martin Story's 2016 Mapping the Patient Experience, are predominantly going to be diagnosis, learning, treatment, and behavior change. The ways that self-tracking would implicate these are many, but one thing that will happen is that this will be an iterative process. So when you start collecting this data, it then becomes a project and a process that is iterated throughout the entirety of the treatment. There's no such thing as diagnosis data and then treatment data. They're all implicated in this process. So that's something that might fundamentally alter or change your own practices depending on the situation. Digital rhetoric, which is the other aspect that I come from, is actually based on a very old tradition, which looks for the best way to share persuasively information and to inform audiences to take action. So it's not just providing them with information. The goal is to treat them. So it has to be something that's persuasive. You can't just hand them an application on a smartphone and then just expect that to be persuasive. We're also looking at how those messages are provided to patients and what the content and tone of those messages are, and if they're given at a appropriate time for this to be persuasive. These are all questions that we look for when we're addressing the applicability and the success of self-tracking applications. Additionally, digital rhetoric focuses a little bit more strongly on how the technology actually changes human behavior and communication. A corollary to this is, of course, determining moments where that breaks down, where the technology runs out of power so you can't track anymore, where the message just hit the nerve of a patient so they just decide to not use it anymore. All of these moments might break down this long-term commitment to using self-tracking as a therapeutic intervention. So these are all important things to address when we're looking at the technology. So additionally, we're also looking at agency. Who has control over the interpretation and intervention side? So when you're giving a technology a little bit more scrutiny over the patient and also analysis capabilities, there are concerns about how much control as practitioners you all would have over the interpretation and over the strategies that you then recommend to your patients. So these are all issues that we're going to be looking at with these applications. As a historical example, of course, rhetoric has been talking about these issues for millennia. Back in 370 BCE, Plato wrote the Phaedrus and offered a criticism of writing as a technology, which seems almost ridiculous now, but he talks about how even that basic moment of recording alters the interaction between individuals with the sharing and transmission of information. So this has been a historically deep and important area for research to understand how different types of mediation, whether it be written form, telephones, computers, the self-tracking applications themselves, all have constraints and effects upon communication. Looking further, then we get to some of the vocabulary that we use to describe what those might be. So several of them are the characteristics of new digital media, the affordances, those things that the technology allows or amplifies the human ability to do things that they couldn't do previously, but then also those constraints, so things that you can't do now because you're relying on a technology instead. In a forthcoming chapter that I wrote with Dr. Hubble, we talk about again, this objectivity problem. Individuals and organizations make compelling claims based on objective data, smart algorithms, and direct comparison to other users' data. When these numerical claims support the user's sense of self, the user pushes themselves further. The fact that these processes are hidden is a luxury. However, when the insights come into direct conflict with the user's personal knowledge of their own needs, the opaque process becomes a problem. So that could, again, become an issue if you're using these technologies and they make recommendations that are at the wrong time or hit the wrong tone with the patient, and they start to lose the credibility for this as a valid treatment. So these are all things that we're going to be looking at for these examples of other applications. Rhetorical concepts more specifically then are, first of all, memory. How is information stored and in what form is it eventually shared with the user? Do they get a pie chart, a line graph? Are they getting summary statistics? Are they getting a simple push notification, you need to go to sleep now, otherwise you'll be grumpy in the morning? What form is this information being relayed to them? There's also invention. What is actually being captured when this data is collected? So one thing is, if you're collecting footstep data, many people would try to correlate that with every behavior imaginable, but we probably want to narrow that down. How much does footstep data actually speak to particular issues? So that's another issue that we look at. Style and arrangement, of course. In what order is the information presented? Are those final conclusions convincing or pleasing? Do they actively teach the user to follow through with the strategy that's suggested? Is that designed as part of the technology? Again, there's delivery, looking at timing. Is the device sending notifications at midnight when it's probably not appropriate? Or is it missing an opportune moment where it could be providing valuable information and then fails to do so? And then again, that agency question. How much power does the user have to customize the device's software to input their own information? And then also on that back end, how much agency and control do you all have to collect certain types of data or to analyze it in a way that would befit your own research agenda or your own therapeutic goals? These are all very important questions. So with that, we get into the actual examples and looking at answering the question. So to start, we'll look at not self-tracking. So the core aspect of the therapeutic relationship then is the individual being able to share some sort of story, a narrative about they're narrating their own experience. And that is an important key aspect because it builds rapport and assists in the treatment later on by building that credibility and trust with the patient. But it's also very important because, as we understand mental disorders, there are all three of these aspects: biological, social, and psychological. And if you get rid of that narrative, it might be problematic because you might lose some of the social, or you might lose some of the other key aspects of treatment and diagnosis. However, there are some existing problems that those who would use self-tracking and advertise them and advocate for them, the technology evangelists, would say to this community, here's why you should be using these technologies. First of all, they say corrects for weak memory. So if you've ever had someone come in and you ask them, how was your week, or 2 weeks, whatever that time interval is, and they're reticent, they don't remember, or they're not willing to share. So this self-tracking technology would allow for a more permanent and persistent record to be captured. The other issue is then less than truthful recollection. So I know one major problem with a lot of mental disorders is individuals who smoke or drink. So you might ask them, how much did you smoke? Are you smoking? Are you not smoking? Are you drinking? Are you not drinking? And this record would have a more, again, persistent and consistent record of actually recording each time that happened, rather than saying, oh, I only did it once, or I kind of did it or didn't do it. It would provide a little bit more information and background. The other thing is, again, filtering out important information. There's a lot that you're relying on the patient to provide you. You ask them a question and then they filter information and provide you with that narrative. With this data, you can start to collect automatically things that might be relevant that you know as an expert that they might not be sharing directly in that exchange. So these are all reasons why you want to start implementing self-tracking technology. Benefits to the patient, they advertise as this personalized medicine. So more data, more answers. The more data they have, the more things they might discover, things that are more unique or personalized for that individual, so it might be easier for them to get a specific treatment plan. The other thing is patients, this one's a little bit more controversial, patients advocate that this allows them to explore their own diagnosis on their own terms, so they can go and take their data to an online community and work with those individuals. Again, they're non-experts, so every app that you'll see has a warning at the top, which is very important. We are not a doctor, we are not professionals, so you should still rely on those professional expertises. However, patients have advertised that this has given them another way for them to work with other communities and get additional input into their own treatment. Paul Abramson, an MD from Medicine X 2012, at a self-tracking symposium at Stanford University, discussed how self-tracking has become an important part of his own practice. And the one thing I really want to highlight is he describes it as a process of engaging with and helping patients to solve problems and make decisions. And that is, in many cases, more important than the data collected. So this is an individual who has not lost that humanistic import, right? So it's still important to engage with the patient, to look through the data with them, to still have that humanistic conversation where they're able to go through this process together. And in this sense, they're able to identify a lot of different things that you might not have seen previously. The contextual and social contributors, environmental factors, diet, whatever it might be, that are involved in treating these healthcare problems. Next, we turn to self-tracking with existing commercial applications. So one major weakness that you actually find with commercial applications on the market today is that throughout the design process and their evaluation prior to them coming to market, the evaluation metrics are primarily technology focused. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If the program is data heavy or uses too much power, you can't use it. But the problem is they're also not looking for the other metrics that are important for evaluation and treatment, such as patient outcomes. It seems a little obvious. So a lot of the commercial applications that you can get for free and download today were not actually designed with the patient outcomes in mind. So that could be a potential danger. Additionally, we look at different types of data that they're capturing, as I mentioned earlier with the inventional stage. So there are two primary types of input data, the passive and the active. The passive data are consistently being collected, so when you're moving around, when you have your GPS pinging or Wi-Fi hotspots are being collected, all of this information is passively being gathered and analyzed for potential insights. At the same time, there's also active data input, so the devices will ask for what's your mood today, and you can select from a range of options, or you can input text into a diary, which then will be analyzed for sentiments, algorithmically for other insights that might be important. The concern here, however, is that just because it's available doesn't mean it's relevant. Try convincing a group of engineers of that. Essentially some of these applications are essentially very expensive mood rings. I don't know if anyone else was of that age where you wore the mood ring around and then showed people what mood you were in. We're essentially creating expensive and highly sophisticated pieces of technology that, because they're not linked strongly through scientific research, are just essentially finding correlations without a good causal explanation for why that might be the case. So that's another thing to be very cautious about if you're advocating the use of a commercial-free application. The other issue then is this elusive idea of the natural behavior, of the perfect specimen that you can look at and they're going to behave naturally and you're going to get perfect clean data from them. Another way of describing this is sort of the Schrodinger's patient. What's natural and what's attentive? So in this case, natural would be how they actually interact when they are not being watched, when they're not being scrutinized, when they go about their daily lives. What are they actually doing? Versus attentive behavior. And attentive behavior means they know they're being watched and they know that they're going to have to input into their self-tracker at the end of the day. So they start to change or modify or maybe even lie about the behavior that they're inputting, because that's something that patients can do. So the concern here is, how do you differentiate between what is this more natural behavior and what is attentive behavior? And studies have shown that over time, people do start to behave more naturally. They sort of forget that they're being tracked, and they start to be more comfortable with the technology. But it can be difficult to determine where that line is, and it takes a lot of commitment. So perhaps weeks of tracking before you really get some data that can be analyzed with any level of accuracy. So this, again, is another concern with using self-tracking technologies. The other issue, then, is data analysis. It's a hidden process. I could go on for hours, so I won't, about this particular issue. But one example is, of course, what is considered normative? Usually when you're doing some sort of statistical analysis comparing one person to a population, you have to have some sort of base population data to do that comparison. And with these commercial apps, we have no idea what that is. Is it a set average baseline that adapts over time to new user inputs? Is it other users that they collected data from during the development stage? Is it just the original developers and their friends and anybody they could sucker into using the app? We have no way of knowing. And the problem with that is that it could provide misinformation or dangerous insight if you're using this as a basis for your treatment recommendations. So, for example, if your patient is here and you're comparing them to this population, they're looking pretty good, but for every other group, they're on the low side of that probability distribution. So because you don't know, it's really difficult and challenging to make strong, valid recommendations based on these commercial applications. Again, another topic that I could spend hours talking about, and I won't, are the potential legal and privacy issues with using a commercial application in order to collect useful patient data. Sort of an ironic twist here, I found this patient privacy poster where individuals entering into an office to talk to their doctors, and anyone there are asked to switch off their phones. But at the same time, many individuals are advocating that we start to use these self-tracking technologies on the patient at all times to start to gather and use their data. Melanie Swan in 2009 looked at these emerging patient-driven healthcare models, and one thing she found is that users are very willing to opt out of their privacy rights. They're quite willing to say, oh yeah, whatever, it's not my concern now, whatever you need, doctor, we'll go ahead and track this data even though it is on a commercial application. So that's one concern for the expertise that's in this room, is you have to almost be concerned for them. So rather than just say, oh, it's okay, just collect your data and it's accessible now and useful publicly, you have to be concerned for them for the potential privacy implications of collecting this data. So now to an example. This is a mood analysis tracker made by Diary Mood Tracker. The install numbers are not exactly precise, but we do know this has been downloaded 100,000 to 500,000 times. And this one is actively updated and iterated on. So I believe their update records are once every several months. So this one is actively used and actively being improved upon. How it works is you download the application, and then you can set the interval, but maybe once a day or twice a day. It asks you to input your emotion, and you are given these 5 emoticons to encapsulate any potential mood. After that, you can select things that you've been up to. So there are icons that are preset with different events such as work, relaxation, a date, friends, gaming, shopping. And on this one, you can add or edit the icons, and you can add new events if you would like to do so. After that, the moods are charted monthly. You can also display them as a mood count, and this is supposed to allow you to sort of track potential triggers for a detrimental mood state and sort of understand what might be causing different fluctuations. A couple of interesting features that are part of this application. There is a security pin to access the app, so individuals might be more willing to use it because even if their phone is unlocked, with the application you have to enter a pin before you can access that data. So there's a little bit more security and privacy there. You could, again, customize the events and icons to capture different experiences that might not be available or standard. And then also you can back it up to Google Drive, so it is easily shared and then can also be retrieved if something were to happen to your phone or your device. But then we get to the analysis part of what are some of the consequences, the benefits of using this sort of technology. So this was the user feedback available publicly on the application page for different experiences and testimonials that users had when they were starting to use these technologies. So over here on the left, we see memory. This individual says, there is a great way to keep a mood journal to help figure out patterns. The only thing I wish it allowed is to edit a past day. If I'm busy and use the Not Now feature, I cannot go back and edit that date later on. So this is extremely frustrating in the design of the application. If they're not up for it, if they don't feel like entering their own information, there's no way that they can go back. And so now we've disrupted the record. So again, lack of memory, lack of capacity to edit means that this might not be a good tool to be using for the patient, let alone for your own uses as part of diagnosis and treatment. The other issue then is people really like this privacy feature, but as I mentioned previously, it might be a false sense of privacy. So it's privacy in their own interpersonal life, so their mom or their dad or their significant other can't start to note it, they won't be able to access the app and start reading through their diary, but all of this data is being uploaded and sent to a commercial proprietary software company. So these are concerns that we have to be cognizant of when we're recommending these applications, because the users sort of have if I don't see it, it doesn't exist, it's not a real problem. Another thing I wanted to point out with this particular user is that they emphasize the accurate account, right? So they really like that this allows them to have something that is quantifiable, it can be sorted, it can be filtered, and they can also refer back to it when they're in a different disposition and sort of evaluate the prior record. So these are all things that, again, might be a good thing about using these tracking technologies. On the same application with some more user feedback, we see that someone was, I think justifiably, upset with the emotional range of 5 emoticons. They say that there are several emotions that I don't encounter every day with different daily occurrences and activities, and it was difficult for them to actually meaningfully provide a record of what was happening in their life because, again, 5 smiley faces are not the full range of human emotion. One really bad thing here was the importance of message tone. So this user said, I don't think this was meant for someone with my disorder. Better for someone with bipolar or depression, not BPD. Also, don't like the fact that it makes it sound like I am personally attacking someone when I delete an activity. When you're dealing with people who have psych disorders, which I assumed this application was for, phrasing things so harshly like, do you want to mercilessly delete activity, can come off very harshly and very unfriendly. So I guarantee you a rhetorician was not on the development team for this application. But these are the sorts of things where if people just don't know the tone and the message content, they think it might be cheeky or cute, can actually be majorly problems for diagnosis and treatment where these things come off as attacks, depending on the disposition of the individual using these applications. So again, these are all things to keep in mind when you're sort of sorting through the options in deciding whether this is something you would want to use in your own practice. There are thousands of these applications available, so there's a lot to choose from, a wide range of options. Next, we get into answering the question from a different side. Do self-track, but doing it with customized designed applications from nonprofits or NIH-funded research. So a couple of issues that come up with the custom designed applications are that they require a large commitment of time up front from both you and the user. Customization requires that you commit to sorting through all of the range of options and saying which data am I going to collect, which strategies do I want built into the application is something that I might recommend to a patient. And you have to sort through all of the potential analyses that you might want to run. So this can be costly for time. But the other issue is, with that large investment of time and money up front, is being cognizant of motivating users to actually use them. These applications don't work if they use them for a day and then discard them. So this is why there is a drawback to possibly using the customized applications. The other issue here is interpreting the data. So now we have much more agency and much more control, but this time that agency and control has been handed to you directly. So on the back end of the application, the user tracks their data, creates records, and these are automatically then sent to you as clinicians in order to evaluate and to parse them. So one primary concern here is that you now have quantitative information to parse and interpret. And an issue is potentially alienating the patient who previously was giving a more narrative form record of their experiences and was working with you to sort of diagnose and devise successful strategies. There is a real danger here with quantitative information and quantitative analysis of you all being able to say, I found the pattern, this is the strategy, go forth and do great things. And then there's this limitation there on interacting with the patient. So once again, emphasizing that there's still a need to have an active voice in interpreting their own data sets and their own records, even if they're not going to know which ANOVA test you used or which probability distribution was more advantageous for the distribution of their data. They probably don't care about that part, but they're still needed to be actively voicing and sharing the interpretive concerns with the outcomes that emerge. So an example of this comes from Optimism Apps. The developer is Optimism Apps Party Limited, founded in 2007. And this is an example of the nonprofit that was invested in sort of creating different self-tracking apps. And they specialize in a suite of popular mood charts and health planning applications. And what happens is there's very specific, there's a general one where you can start to try to diagnose, but then there's very particular ones if you already have a general idea. Do they have general anxiety? Do they have an eating disorder? Whatever it is, you can pick a more particularized app. And then there's a dashboard for you as the professional, and that's the side where there's a small subscription fee for this service, where all of this core data that's collected by the users is then brought to you, and you can sort through it and use your own techniques to understand and communicate with the patient that way. As an example here, we see the editable track here of the Likert scale from 1 to 10, where they can talk about well-being, how they coped with something, their sleep quality. It goes down and it's customizable, so you can put sleep there, you can put nutrition there, you can put smoking, drinking, whatever it is, you can start to look for different things depending on the user patient that might be applicable. But then on the other side of this, you can also start to put the strategies that you have recommended to them. So getting 8 hours of sleep, drinking plenty of water, whatever it might be, you can start to customize and put these different outputs in, and then actually track their success on these strategies, where they are perhaps not always honest, but they can start to say, on this day I did it, on this day I didn't, what happened, how did this break down? So that might be an advantageous way to start to track and look at patterns in both diagnosis and treatment. It also comes with an expansive analysis suite, as I mentioned, where there's many options for analysis and synthesis of collected data. You can also download it and use your own platform, whatever it is. I don't know how many of you guys are data quants, but if that's something you're interested in, these things are accessible for you to be able to use as a tool. And this was that example of the dashboard, so you can start to see which ones you click and sort through. And there are many options here and different symptoms that you can start to look for and triggers and then narrow those down. Now to the user feedback. Someone actually found this overwhelming. So this is a case of a user who, through contextual clues, I think downloaded this application without having that expert individual on the back end setting the options. And they actually found it extremely overwhelming. So again, when they write at the top that disclaimer, still seek out professional guidance and help, this rings true, right? Rings true. It's still very important to seek out that expert opinion, even when you're using these sort of personalized, customizable tracking applications. And again, there's also this issue of the commitment of continuing to use it day after day in order for it to be relevant and applicable. Another thing I wanted to point out here is this is an individual looking at cognitive behavioral therapy and looking at my feelings and thinking objectively, so I can find the distortions that are causing emotional pain and anxiety. So this tool was actually helpful for them to provide a little bit of space for reflection so they can refer back to these logs later and then critically go through what caused it and what happened, rather than trying to evaluate those moments as they occur because of the term, they're distortions, and there's a distortion effect. There are also many other research applications that are like this. So this one is free to use. It was developed by Northwestern University and Northwestern Medicine. They're called IntelliCare apps. So these don't require a subscription for you to use. They are in development, so they're not going to be as pretty or attractive as some of the commercial apps, but they can also be very effective. So this team, in fact, brought in academic researchers, psychologists, and software developers who are really dedicated in pushing forward positive behavioral changes with their patients. So this again is, there's thousands of these available, but hopefully through the examples we've touched on potential complications and also benefits of why you might use one or the other. With that, we get to conclusions. So hopefully today I shared with you a balanced understanding of why you might want to use self-tracking or quantified self technology in your own professional practice. So self-tracking may be beneficial to some patients. To implement it successfully, you probably should customize data collection. Try to minimize the cost and time spent collecting because of that large motivational push and commitment that's required in order to get people to track over an extended period of time. And then also continuing to treat patients as trustworthy narrators for their own data. So still allowing that process to emerge where you become the credible authority that's helping them interpret and sort through their data or their life in some way to help treat them. If done poorly, self-tracking can be alienating, it can be overwhelming, and it can often lead to misguided treatment plans. So these are all things to be cautious about when implementing this new technology. With that, thank you for having me, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you, great presentation. I am sort of stunned when I hear that there are thousands of these, and I go, uh-oh, how do I, as a professional, have some handle on what characteristics of them are, or what, the real bottom line question I have is, I've got a patient, what would be a good app for this patient to use, and how do I get enough knowledge about the different apps to figure that out?
Well, I have the joking answer, which is wait a year for me to publish. The real answer, though, is that there are some evaluations done by professional societies, so I don't know how you guys would feel about the different ones, but in my research and preparation, I found that many societies that, treating depression or the Professional Society for Psychiatry, really you're a different type of expertise, so I'm sorry if I just butchered the names of those. They have their own articles or guidance where they say, here are 10 that we've evaluated and here's what we saw and how well they worked. Again, those are sadly going to be outdated probably very quickly. Hopefully I've given you guys a sort of intuition so you can sort of pick it up, and even if you don't have the time to do this full-scale evaluation, you can start to see a couple of things that you know to look for now when you're looking through an application. It is a very, very difficult question and problem going into the future.
Candice, can you comment on why, based on your sort of understanding of the social dynamics of data collection, why are we so readily, we have no barriers to sharing data like with Facebook, with Google. What is it about our essence potentially, or any factors that drive us so willingly to give up our privacy?
So there are probably a lot of really great answers to that. The one that I have, because it rings true with my own practice and research, is that there's been a push towards objective assessment and validation in the last 200 to 300 years, where when we don't live next to each other and we don't know people interpersonally, it's hard for us to trust a narrative. So instead of just being able to say, hey Joe, I went and fed the cattle, we now have an app that, or some sort of documentation where you can say, I went and fed all 3,000 cattle and I fed them this amount. That sort of transition. The same way with, on the interpersonal level, I now say I ran far. Well, what's far? That's a subjective thing. It doesn't matter to anyone. They don't know what that means. But I now have the one thing that I still hold on to because I like it so much is my GPS app. So now I can show my half marathon records and my stats to all my friends. And so like that makes me feel cool because it's not just I ran far, it's I ran really far. And here's an actual number and vector for you to see how well I did. And so I think those are all parts of it. It's an objective measure to then be evaluated against people who might not know you personally. Yeah.
I found myself really thinking quite carefully about your experience that you talked about early in your presentation and how you found your experience using some of these apps to be extremely negative. And I think the way that you phrased your intention in using the apps was to improve performance. And my impression of that is that that was a factor in why your experience may have been so negative. Because improving performance is just one aspect of our lived experience. So I'm thinking again about how we can apply your experience to what we would expect a patient's experience to be in using some of these applications to improve health outcomes, mental health outcomes, whatever goals we might have. And I'm wondering about application developers and whether or not these applications are being developed in such a way that we have the ability to input data in a way that can be amended based on our outcome goals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, so I'm a strong advocate of having interdisciplinary developer teams, so it's not just the engineering capacity, it's also bringing in actual people. So my friend here, actually from RPI, a computer scientist PhD, works with a team who are starting to bring in more psychologists, I believe, to work with them when they're developing these sort of tracking applications and big social data applications. There are also other applications such as cyberbullying trackers, where you use this application in order to start to sort through instances of cyberbullying and then provide intervention strategies to young individuals who are then dealing with that problem. And they actually brought in the expertise from that field in order to program and design these to be successful. So that is one thing I think, going back to the deciding which app to use, if it says interdisciplinary on it, it's probably going to be way better than anything else on the market. So that's another technique you could probably use to filter for something. Going back to that original experience, one of the things I found was not just that I was solely focused on optimization, it was also that I lost spontaneity just because of the nature of the data I was collecting. If it didn't fit into a classification or a definition that was available in the application, I felt like I couldn't do it. I couldn't eat the brownie because someone brought it from home and I didn't have the nutrition label to scan. I stopped running on wooded trails because my GPS watch wouldn't connect to the satellite, so I would lose data. And I know I have a very particular personality type, so this is not, of course, something to generalize to, but it felt really bad to me to lose data or lose the quality of my data by not being able to capture everything accurately. So that's why I eventually found it too constraining and just threw it out the window. I see another hand.
You touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to pose a question. Again, in your experience, how are patients more often encountering these applications? Is it through a provider, or are they going out and seeking them themselves? And does one or the other affect the patient experience in any way?
So I think most of the time, this is people who are trying to avoid the stigma of seeking out help. So many of them will turn to this as the first route. It's a hidden application, so they'll try to use this. There's also anonymized or pseudo-anonymous online health social networks. Well, they'll use these trackers and then bring that data to these intervals and then talk about it there. So I think one thing, I wish that if these things were to be implemented, I think they're more successfully and more healthily done using the relationship and the expertise in this room. But many of these applications right now are just being haphazardly downloaded, and it's an avoidance strategy for seeking help through a professional channel. So, but not in, take that with a grain of salt. This is from my research. I haven't done a full-scale interviews or anything to determine what that route would be.
I don't know if you thought about, like, when using this type of application, I mean in therapy, like, how much is the risk of the patient, the clinician losing his patient, like that relationships, by just by having the patient control his symptoms on this app, or seeing that progress that with the crack, maybe with the great feeling better day after day. Does that, do you see risk of interrupting that therapeutic relationship, or the patient just quit therapy because they're doing well on the app?
I think this is a major issue, and I tried to highlight that controversial claim at the very beginning where people say, this gives patients control, so they can just go from office to office and shop for their doctor, which is a heinous idea, right? There's supposed to be a commitment on both sides, and it takes time. So that's from their perspective is, let's consumerize this process by keeping my data and then I can shop around. That's terrible, right? So I think there's framing becomes very important, the framing of what these applications do. One issue is that many of the applications have buried in their EULA agreements, this is not a medical opinion and you should be still seeing some sort of professional input, but it's buried and it's not highlighted. The other ones, that research program, for example, puts it right in center, right at the top. So they're doing a great job of framing what this is. It's a tool, it's not a stand-in, it's not a replacement for that relationship. So I think that's a very important issue going forward, is it's going to be a concern of people just saying, oh, I can substitute these two things, and they're not very well substituted, and you don't see positive outcomes. So that's one area that I think it's important to continue to frame these as tools, not replacements.
So we've been talking about some of this stuff in our clinic, not necessarily as tracking mood or things like that, but just in general, like this idea of tracking. And I guess I was wondering if you had any thoughts about, and so one of the discussions we were having was whether these are things that serve to sort of motivate people to exercise more, or to do any kind of activity because there's something that you're using to track, and so that's kind of motivating you to do it more, or is there something that changes about the quality of the activity, or something that improves, whether it was some other way of motivating it, or is there something about the technology that also is involved in improving the quality? Or?
I think it's probably a little bit of all of the above, and also depends on the person. I find tracking to be motivating, so again, the one that I kept was the running watch. Being able to see my calendar over time and see, wow, I went 4 days without running, I better get off the couch and stop eating the potato chips. That's motivating for me. Just because I can then see that I'm not doing well enough. So that might be an issue is, so for example with the mood calendars or the mood charts, you would recommend that someone use those, and one concern is that they could just go back and in 5 minutes right before your appointment, scribble in the data for that hand-done mood chart. So rather than using that, you might use this technology, and it sends a push notification to them saying, remember, you will be asked to provide this later on this week. That could then be motivational because it's sort of, it's persistent, and it's a little bit of that eye watching them. So it's almost like you're amplifying your ability to be with them and remind them of how important the treatment strategy is. There's that give and take. Some people, they get enough push notifications, they they erase the app because they're now overwhelmed. Some people do find it to be successful. I think it depends on the person. So. Pardon?
Are you making an app?
Am I making an app? I'm writing a dissertation. Someday. No, I do really, you know, after I write the dissertation, maybe I'm gonna, well, then I have to write grants to get funded, so.